Hello, Void Dwellers. I wish I could say that the news about the activist murdered by the IDF in the West Bank is just blood libel or anti-Semitism, but it's not. As someone who was an activist, I can tell you that I'm not surprised. It's not the first time something like that has happened. You put stupid 18-year-old children in an occupied area where they are a target 24/7. You put a rifle in their hands and you tell them to stop any disorder by the locals and by activists. And what do you think is going to happen? And the IDF's response is lame and shameful. The force was firing at rioters who threw rocks at them and put their lives in danger, is what they said. There was a time when IDF soldiers were ordered to use non-lethal rubber bullets and tear gas against unarmed rioters, not live rounds. Those days are over. We used to say the occupation corrupts. Boy, were we right. And unfortunately, we were proven right every single day. And not just in the West Bank, but inside of Israel. In Israeli politics. It's why Netanyahu managed to stay in power for so long. Because he is one of those corrupted leaders who thrive on conflict. Netanyahu doesn't have a political existence without the conflict. His entire shtick for over 2 decades is that he is Mr. Security. And you have to vote for him because if you don't, they'll come for your children. Which is why the 7th of October was so disastrous for him, because he was in power and they still came for our children in the most horrific way imaginable. So now his new thing is to make this war go on for as long as possible, because the shtick now is that you can't have an election in the middle of a war. First you have to let him win for Israel. But of course, the moment there is an election, he'll lose, and he knows that. So it's in his best interest to make this war as long as possible. Legally speaking, Netanyahu has until the 27th of October 2026, by which time the country is supposed to have an election. So he wants to bide his time until that date, in the hope of regaining political strength through this war. And for that, he is willing to sacrifice everyone, Palestinians or Jews, the Gazans and the hostages. And the really depressing thing, while he is still very obviously going to lose the elections, the polls show that he is recovering a little bit. He is today a few points higher in the polls than he was right after the 7th of October. Let me tell you something, I love Israel, but Israelis are sometimes fucking impossible. The stupidity can be overwhelmingly depressing. And to be completely honest, it's a big part of why I left. In fact, after the 2015 elections, when Netanyahu and the right were elected again in a pretty big majority, after us leftists campaigning for years against them because not just the conflict, but the economy that has gone to shit at the time, and the fact that the country has become more and more conservative and religious, that's when I decided to leave. That's when I said, you know what? You guys seem to have a handle on things, so, good luck to everyone and I'm fucking off. And I said, this is a government and a Knesset that would bring Israel disasters. Of course, not in my worst nightmares did I imagine the horrors they would bring on the country. And now, just to maintain his coalition, Netanyahu let some very evil people into his government and put them in places of power. People who believe in the settlements and want to see them grow, regardless of their illegality under both Israeli and international law. And they are a big part of the reason that the West Bank is heating up as well. So in short, no, I cannot say that it is anti-Semitic to criticize the IDF or Israel for executing an unarmed activist protesting in an occupied territory. However, what is anti-Semitic is the fact that the story gets world headlines, as it should, but Jewish victims of Palestinian terrorism are not even reported in 90% of the time. For example, you've never heard of those 3 Israeli police officers who were murdered sitting in their car by a terrorist just last week. They were too Jewish to be reported to the English-speaking world. Or that huge explosion in Tel Aviv that turned out to be a Palestinian bomber who apparently had an accident and triggered his bomb too early, so luckily there were only a few injured. Or those two Israelis who were murdered in a terrorist knife attack in the city of Hulon last month. They were also too Jewish to be worth mentioning by the world media. Or the Israelis injured by a terrorist in Jerusalem this March. And the list goes on and on and on and on. The UN called for an inquiry after the shooting of the activist in the West Bank, but not after any of these cases. It's the double standard that is anti-Semitic. The media does not report all terror attacks and tragedies when they happen. It reports on those that enforce the anti-Semitic narrative they are building. If your death helps them say how evil Jews are, you will become a celebrity in death. But if you're Jewish and you were murdered by a terrorist for being Jewish, unless you happen to be an American or British, nobody in the English-speaking world would even hear about it. And then, when the IDF performs a completely legitimate action against terrorists to try and prevent those attacks, the media hides the truth and just reports it as Israel raids, enter a name of some Arabic-sounding place, as fake number of Palestinians, gajillion bajillion, not terrorists or militants, but Palestinians, are killed. And that's even when the IDF provides photos of the things that they found in the raid, the reason for it, which is because the place they raided was a bomb-making lab. The anti-Semites in the media and outside of it have created an atmosphere where people like me feel uncomfortable to criticize Israel and the IDF even when there should be criticism. Because 99% of what you constantly hear are lies, exaggerations, and distortions of truth. So I feel that if I criticize Israel, even when I should, I'm just adding ammunition to people who would love nothing more than to see me and my family murdered. And that's not just about the conflict, by the way. As an atheist and a liberal, I used to talk and write a lot back in Israel about the more ridiculous or primitive side of Judaism, about some of the more violent or just plain moronic things they say in the Talmud, for example. I believe that a secular Israel is better than a religious one. But outside of Israel, I found anti-Semites using some very similar examples to the ones I used to point out, mixed with a lot of misinformation all the way up to complete fiction, of course, in order to vilify Judaism as a whole, as if Christianity and Islam are not just as violent and dumb, if not more so. So I find myself defending in English that which I attack in Hebrew. It's an annoyingly splitting situation to find yourself in. Everything becomes more complicated because you keep having to tap dance between the inconsistencies and hypocrisies of the racists and those who want to believe them, and your own real point that you are trying to make. And in no other subject is it worse than in the conflict with the Palestinians. Instead of all of us who share humanist values coming together and rage against any type of violation of those values, whether it's a pro-Palestinian activist being executed for protesting or a Jew being murdered by a terrorist for being a Jew, the media uses those tragedies to divide and conquer us. That is why all we had since the beginning of the war are hate marches with genocidal slogans like "From the river to the sea." If there were demonstrations calling for the release of the hostages and a ceasefire, for an end to all attacks on all civilians, I would have participated in those, along with many people like me. Instead, it was the racists, the anti-Semites, and the Islamists who took over the streets in the West. And the true liberals? We stayed home. And this is the situation that is encouraged by the divide and conquer of the media. I fully believe that in a world where the media didn't exist, or at the very least was regulated to make them accountable, to stop them from printing lies, and to force them to be balanced and paint a full picture of reality, this conflict would have been over long ago. Corrupted leaders like Netanyahu use this conflict for political gain, but so does the media. They use this and other conflicts around the world as clickbait material. They are profiteers of war and death, and they have the interest to make sure war and death stay in business. If we want to save lives, we need to stop corrupted leaders, absolutely. But we also need to stop the corrupted media. The connection between the two is the same as the connection that used to be between kings and the church. They compete with each other, sometimes turn on each other, sure, but in the end, they are dependent on each other. No change can ever be made without dismantling the unlimited power that the media has over our lives. If we don't do that, then all those lives lost will be in vain.